Hello, BookTube. It's our second Sunday of our May read-along, where we're working our way through the Gospels of the New Testament as reading experiences rather than as homilies for Sunday service. And we started with the Gospel of St. Matthew, and today we're doing the Gospel of St. Mark, even though you don't have to read much of Mark to realize that should have been reversed. That obviously Mark came first. Mark is the earliest of the Gospels, and also, as far as we know, the author of the Gospel of Mark, whoever he was, invented the genre of what a gospel is. Not strictly a biography, certainly not strictly a history, not even strictly chronological, but rather a faith testimony, a proclamation of something. Difficult to describe, despite the fact that the gospel genre, in the form of these four and some of the others that were left out of the canonical Bible, have exercised an enormous influence on the world. Even so, it's difficult to come to grips with what a gospel really is. And I want to know about your reading experiences with the Gospel of Mark. I have a feeling, I'd be willing to bet my last Boston cream pie, that your reading experience with Mark is going to be radically different than the one you had with Matthew. And some of that, depending on the translation that you use, will be an accurate reflection of what it's like to read it in the original. The reading Mark in the original is radically different from reading Matthew in the original. Mark is not a sophisticated writer, to put it mildly. His gospel, on a purely rhetorical level, is boring, grubby, inept, in a way that whoever wrote Matthew was clearly correcting as he went along. Clearly he was using Matthew or Mark as a raw material that he could improve. The interesting thing, one of the many interesting things about the Gospel of St. Mark, is that he too clearly is using raw materials. He's not making them much less raw with his own treatment of them, but he is clearly retailing material that was in his faith community and assembling it and marshaling it and sharpening it for his own purposes. And again, you don't need to know anything. The whole point of this read-along is that you don't need to know anything about these Gospels to read them and to see what's going on in them and to get impressions from them. You do not, especially, need to think that this is a closed club of some kind. That most certainly isn't true. You don't need to be a believing Christian, and you certainly don't need to be a scholar of Christianity to read these things and find the fascinating bits in them. But it helps a little to know, when we're talking about Mark assembling raw material from his faith community, it helps a little to know probably what was going on in the larger picture of that faith community. And that brings us to the subject of dating the Gospel of Mark. And there are all sorts of people who have done their whole careers, literally writing for 60 years and then going to a quiet grave somewhere, on dating the Gospel of Mark. So this isn't going to be definitive by any means, but the scholarship convinces me that Mark wrote his Gospel sometime, and when I say Mark, I mean the author of the Gospel. The author of the Gospel was not. Just for shorthand's sake, I'm saying the Gospel is written by someone named Mark. But to me, the evidence looks pretty clear that Mark was written during the Roman Emperor Nero's persecution of the Christians. There's a great deal of suffering in Mark. There's a great deal of, when you take a step back and look at it and attempt to justify suffering, to put it in its place and even to ennoble it, that isn't quite there in Matthew. That plus there are a whole bunch of internal flags here, there, and elsewhere that lead me to think this was written in the AD 60s, somewhere in the AD 60s, which means that Mark would have been using fragments and bits and pieces and oral tradition even that date right to the beginning of Christianity. And it kind of shows. He is much less concerned than any other of the synoptic Gospels leaving aside John. We'll get to John. Matthew and Luke, Mark is far less concerned than they are with telling a story in the sense of one overarching theme. His gospel famously is ragged. It has a jump cut feel to its beginning and a very abrupt ending, an ending so abrupt that it led to a whole pseudo-scholarly tradition over the millennia of faking endings to Mark, of adding endings where it's pretty obvious from the documents that we have that wasn't what Mark wrote, that his gospel actually ends at place A, and many subsequent scholars have wanted it to end later, wanted there to be more of it. Now, on one human level, I can understand that, because I don't ever read any of the gospels without wishing they were longer. Even Mark, I wish that they were longer. But no, when it comes to Mark, when it comes to reading Mark, I'll be interested again in hearing your comments, but I'd be willing to think that your impression will be that this was not a smooth story. And also, Mark famously changes register completely at around 8. The beginning is a wonder-working ministry. Jesus is performing miracles all over the place, and all kinds of miracles, up until about 8. And then from 8 on, the tone and the pitch seems to be very different, almost as if they were written at 2 different times for 2 different audiences. After that, it becomes very teaching-oriented, very more or less scripture-oriented. It becomes very ideological and not so much wonder-working. And all of this leads to a feeling, at least for me. I reread Mark for this read-along, and I did it with as clear a mind as I could possibly have, taking new notes, which is always fun. And to me, it underscored the fact that this wasn't meant to be read in the same way as the other Gospels. And that raises, for me, always with Mark, a question of why the author wanted it to be read at all. Why was this book even written? Jesus in Mark's Gospel says, I tell you truly that there are those of you who are alive today who will live to see the end of the world and the second coming, the coming of the Son of Christ, the Son of Man, the kingdom of heaven, will happen in your own lifetime. And in Mark and in other Gospels, he's forever telling people, don't store up treasure, don't worry about tomorrow. Everything, all of this, everything that you see is about to come to an end. Not metaphorically speaking. That he tells his audience, there are people in the audience right now who will live long enough to see what I'm talking about. Implying that he has a time in mind, right? And that the time is not far away. So why would Mark feel the need to write anything at all? Why would anybody feel the need to write down a gospel? Mark, whoever wrote this gospel, is clearly in the process, probably the very beginning of the process, of taking the disparate materials of this movement called Christianity and giving them written text. And the whole purpose of giving a written text is for transmission, for travel, for use down the line when you're not around to say it yourself. And why would anybody do that if their own central Messiah figure is telling them that it isn't necessary? That's always confused me, and I don't find an answer in Mark. I'm just raising the question. But the other element in Mark that I'm betting you'll have noticed, it's not really there in Matthew, and it's the only element in Mark that I think Mark handles really well as a writer. And that element goes along. It actually fits with the idea that this was compiled during a time when Christians were being persecuted by the Roman authorities. And that element is secrecy, the famous secrecy of Mark. Mark's Jesus does not want people to know that he's the Messiah. He does not want to openly proclaim himself. He does not want word to spread. He doesn't even really want attribution for a lot of the wonders that he works. And just as a side note, he doesn't yet seem quite adept at working wonders. He makes mistakes. He tries to heal a blind man and has to take 2 tries at it. He uses incantations and weird spells and his fingers and mud. That the Jesus of the other gospel have moved beyond that. The Jesus that we typically see largely comes from Matthew, but I think much more comes from Luke. than people usually say. And that Jesus is far more of what we consider in the later thinking, far more of what we consider a godlike, with a capital G, figure, where wonders are worked simply by him wanting them to happen. He doesn't have to wave a wand or do anything like that. He's not a wizard. He's God, and reality comports with his will. That's not so much true yet in Mark. Mark's Jesus is a wonder worker in a more lowercase letter version of that term, at least at the beginning. At the beginning, but all throughout, whether he's good or bad at miracles, he's more clandestine than in other gospels. Constantly telling people, don't tell anyone what you've seen. Don't if I've cured you, you simply go and register yourself as no longer a cripple with the authorities, but don't tell them anything about me. And the part that Matthew does well that Mark does well as a writer in this gospel about that is that he plays on it, which is a very writerly thing to do. And there's almost nothing in Mark that's very writerly, but this is very writerly. He plays on the fact that Jesus' disciples and the people around him just don't seem to get it. They hear God. The disciples hear God himself, the voice of God, rolling out from heaven, declaring that Jesus is his son. They hear that a number of times in the gospel. And it still doesn't seem to register. They see all these amazing things, a man walking on water, a man calming the storm, and it doesn't quite register with them. And Mark clearly knows on one level how frustrating that will be for the reader. Not for himself and not for other characters in the story, but for the reader who knows more than the characters in the story do. And one of the masterful ways that he does that he plays on that ignorance, is to have other supernatural beings already know what the disciples don't know, and what the reader does know. I have an example that I want to read you. It's a famous one, of course. This is from the very beginning of Mark. And they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, he, that is Jesus, entered the synagogue and taught. And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority, not as the scribes. And immediately there was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent, and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him, and they were all amazed, so that they questioned among themselves, saying, "What is this? A new teaching. With authority he commands even unclean spirits, and they obey him." And at once his fame spread everywhere, throughout all the surrounding region of Galilee. And two things to note there. One is something that we saw when we talked about Matthew, which is this feeling that runs throughout all the Gospels, that Jesus is bringing the old teachings alive. That line about he speaks with authority, not like the scribes do, not like our priests do. The priests get up, they unscroll, a text, they drone from it, but they don't seem to have any authority. It doesn't seem to live with them, whereas Jesus seems to make the law live. He seems to bring it alive. That's wonderful, and that's consistent with the other Gospels. But that bit where the spirit inside the possessed man recognizes Jesus, knows who he is, and Jesus commands him to be silent. And the people who are listening don't get it. They don't get it. This is not the only time. This happens throughout Mark, where supernatural forces recognize Jesus, but the people around him don't, except for the key moment, the just shattering moment, the moment that actually changes the trajectory of Mark. Like we talked about, it becomes two different books, and it becomes so almost exactly on the hinge of one moment, when the disciples have gathered together with Jesus, and they're talking about the rumors that are spreading about him all throughout Galilee, all throughout Judea, and Jesus wants to know what the rumors are, and the disciples say, well, some people say you're Moses, some people say you're Elijah come again. The later elaborations on the gospel say that some people say you're John the Baptist, because they don't believe he's dead. Because John the Baptist has an elaborate treatment in Mark, the most elaborate treatment in Mark of any gospel. Wonderfully done, wonderfully evocative, clearly the remnant of a much bigger and more elaborate dramatic tradition that we don't have anymore. But Jesus stops them. in a classic moment, a classic Jesus moment. Actually, the one of the key aspects of Jesus' character that stays true through all the Gospels is the unsettling way he has of stopping the conversation and going straight at you to make you uncomfortable, to make you assess yourself, to confront you with the truth. That's just wonderful. I think that's just wonderful. And that remains, Jesus is a very different character in all four Gospels, but that remains true in every case. And it's a subject for another discussion, and not these at all, but that also, things like that, little things like that, lead me to think that there was somebody that, at the heart of all this, there's a wide movement that claims that Jesus was not a historical figure at all, that he's a composite mythological figure. But I think if that were explicitly true, some of the essential natures of this guy's character wouldn't be so consistent from gospel to gospel. If he were open to negotiation, so to speak, by any writer who grabs him, I think those things would be washed away, one way or another. He goes straight to the heart of their banter and says, "Who do you say that I am?" And he's not necessarily talking about the answers they make to people they hear. He's also talking about what they say in their hearts. And they fumble, and they don't know what to do. And Peter says, "You're the Messiah. You're the Son of God." It's a quintessential moment. And Jesus, in line with what I'm talking about this gospel, immediately tells him not to tell anyone. Which seems a little bit at odds, right? With what we consider to be Jesus' mission on earth, which is to spread the gospel of the kingdom of heaven, with himself as a key figure in that gospel. But usually not in Mark. That brings us to sort of that's sort of the end of the general remarks that I want to make. Of course, I like with all of these gospels, I could talk for an hour about Mark. Just the ending of Mark alone is fascinating in its own right. The changing resurrection scene from gospel to gospel is fascinating in its own right. Mark's ending, to say the least, for believing Christians, has a number of problems. The main which is that the bits and pieces that Mark chooses to pull together to mush into his own resurrection narrative don't really make sense when they're combined with each other. The ways that he's chosen to combine them don't really make sense. Like, for instance, why would the women who want to anoint the dead body bother to go to the tomb if they knew there was a multi-ton rock that had been rolled in front of the entrance? They ask themselves, who will roll away the stone? Keep in mind, Mark's gospel doesn't have the later appurtenances of other gospel writers where there are guards and a retinue of people all around the tomb. The women wouldn't go and then get halfway there and say, well, how are we going to get this multi-ton rock moved? They know they can't move it themselves. Stuff like that, little details like that, or being told, go and tell my brothers, but then we're told they don't. Little bits and pieces like that are what have led people to elaborate on the ending of Mark. They also create problems on their own, and I think they show at heart one of the defining qualities of Mark, which is endearing but also a little frustrating, which is that he's not a very good storyteller. He is by far the most primitive of the Gospels, and maybe, therefore, the most unsatisfying to read. That's what I want to know from you, among the many, many other things that I want to know. I mainly want to know, did you find this as satisfying as Matthew? Just to read as a work of literature. And also, did you notice any differences that really stuck? I mean, there are differences between all the Gospels, but were there any differences that really jumped out at you? And if so, what were they? And did any of them have to do with the nature of Jesus? Did he? These readings we're tending in these readings just to focus on him, and as a character, because he's the central character, all of them. Did he seem like a completely different character than the Jesus that Matthew writes about, or very similar? And one last question before we wrap up is, you read Matthew, and now you've read Mark. You read the two of them. You naturally compare them side by side because it's just been a week. For some of you have been emailing me and texting me saying that you haven't read these things as literature ever, and that it's been fun for you to do. That's great. That's just what I want to hear. You've read Matthew, and now just recently you've read Mark, and you've read them together. Another of the questions that I want to part with here is, given that combined reading experience, Do you want to read another gospel? Imagine a world in which Matthew and Mark were the only gospels that we had, and you had first read Matthew, and now you've read Mark. Would you wish for more gospels? Would you wish that you could read more set in this world about this character? No right answer, no wrong answer. I just want to know. I want to know the answer to those questions. I'm going to wrap it up for now because Mark's gospel is really short. We would either need 2 days or 20 minutes is just about right. And next week we're going to go on to my favorite of the gospels, the Gospel of St. Luke. And I'm going to try to keep that video short. Mark, I never have that much to talk about. He's fairly simple, and he's not trying to do much. And a lot of what he's trying to do, he's doing very poorly. Luke is the exact opposite of that in every conceivable way. Luke is a writer who, had he not chosen to turn his gifts to this, could have turned his gifts to something else that we would still be reading and still be venerating. So I think you'll find it will be a very different reading experience. But one way or another, I don't want to too much prejudice that. So we'll stick with Mark for now. And I just want to know, with Mark, usually discussions like this for me always revolve around a lot of questions rather than a lot of analysis, because there isn't much there to analyze, in my opinion. Not on the first brush, not on a general literary level. I mainly want to know what you made of it. How different a reading experience was this than reading Matthew? I'm going to wrap this up for now, and we'll move on to Luke next time. So thank you, BookTube. I'll see you soon.